Hi and welcome. My name is Julianne Cost, and in the next few minutes we're going to take a look at the Develop module in Lightroom in order to make enhancements to our images. So you'll notice here that I'm starting in the Library module, but I've created a collection of images, and if I want to move over to the Develop module, I can either click where it says Develop here in my module picker, or I can simply tap the D key, and the D key will take me over to the Develop module. Now, over on the right-hand side, we have a number of different tools. I'm going to scroll down to the lens correction panel, but I do want to just mention that the panels, no matter what module you're in, you can actually change them so that you really only see one panel at a time. And the way you would do that is you would right mouse click anywhere next to the header of any panel, or on the Mac you would control click, and then you would choose solo mode. So it's a really nice mode to be in when, say, you have limited screen real estate. So for example, while I'm in here, if I scroll up and I wanted to look at the basic panel, if I click on basic and then we scroll down, you'll notice that the lens correction panel automatically closed. So you don't have to scroll as far. So I usually, when I'm on my laptop, convert this over to the solo mode. You'll also notice that once it's in solo mode, I get a little visual indicator in that these triangles here, instead of being solid, they're actually dotted. All right, so let's click on lens correction, and while you're in the lens correction panel, there's actually two different areas that you can apply the lens correction profile in order to remove the distortion that's caused in the lens. We can either do that in the basic panel by enabling the profile correction here, or we can go over to the profile area and enable it here. And in fact, if we move back over to the basic, you can see that it remains enabled. But the reason that I wanted to show it to you in the profile area was just to explain that based on the EXIF data, the information that's actually in the file, and that was given to the file by the camera, we can determine the make and model of the camera and automatically apply the correct profile. So again, you'll notice when I enable this, it is removing the distortion. It's not correcting perspective, but it is removing any distortion in the lens. All right, let's move on to the next image here. In this image, we have something called chromatic aberration. And if I zoom in, especially on the edge of the image, and we look in any really high contrast areas, we can see that the pixels along the edges of the file are a little bit misaligned. They're out of alignment. And so on one side of this dark edge, we have a kind of green, and over here we have a magenta. So again, in the lens correction area, if I click on the basic area, you'll see that I can remove the chromatic aberration, and I could do the same thing over here in the color area. I can remove chromatic aberration, but just in case the automated tool doesn't work well enough for your specific image, there are additional options down here to defringe it. So for example, if maybe all of the magenta wasn't removed, we could go ahead and use the amount slider. But in this case, it was. So just by enabling that, you can see that we're removing that chromatic aberration. All right, let's move to the next image here, and I'm going to zoom out. You can see that this image is obviously tilted, and I would like to correct that tilt. So still in lens correction, I'm going to move to the basic area here. I'm going to enable the profile correction and remove chromatic aberration, but I'm also going to use the upright feature. You can see here there's an option to level an image, and so I'll just click on that and Lightroom will go ahead and straighten it for me. So this is quite a nice automated feature. I could do this using the straighten tool in the crop tool, but if Lightroom can do it for me, why not just use lens correction? All right, a few of the other upright options here. If we move to another image like this, you can see that this image was actually photographed while the camera was kind of looking up at the building. Well, if I want to run the upright feature, I definitely want to enable the profile correction, chromatic aberration, and then instead of just leveling it, I'm going to do an auto upright conversion, and you can see that Lightroom tries to straighten the perspective of the building. Now the auto correction does kind of more of a balance correction, so it's not always going to be optically correct, meaning that the lines aren't all going to be horizontal and vertical in the image. So if I want to push upright to make sure that the verticals are vertical, then I will click on the vertical option. You can see they got a little bit straighter there. Now, if I go under the View menu and I come down to Loop Overlay, you'll notice that I can actually overlay a grid or guides on top of my image. And I would toggle this on and off using the shortcut Command Option O or Control Alt O. So let's go ahead and toggle that on, and now we can see not only the grid but also these guides. If I didn't want to see the guides, we could return back to the View menu, Loop Overlay, and then uncheck the guide area. Now, if I hold down the Command key or the Control key on Windows, you can see that I can change the size and opacity by positioning my cursor over the word and then clicking and dragging left to decrease or right to increase opacity, and the same with the size, so we can make this a small or large grid. And as I enlarge this grid, we can really see that by using the vertical option in upright, those windows are straight. All right, let's go ahead and talk about cropping our images. I'm going to move to this image here, and let's turn off that grid using Option Command O or Alt Control O. And I'm going to tap the R key. The R key is the shortcut for the crop tool, but all of the tools in the Develop module are right here underneath the histogram. So I could just simply click in order to select it, and we see all of the options for the crop tool appear underneath. Now, the crop tool also has a grid overlay. If I wanted to change the view here, I would actually go into the Tools menu and then down to Crop Guide Overlay. You can see that there are a number of different overlays that Lightroom can show, and you would cycle through them using the O key. What I actually like to do is go to the Tool Overlay area, and instead of having this overlay always show, I'm going to change that to Auto Show. Now you'll notice that the grid doesn't overlay until I actually start clicking and dragging my crop. Then as soon as I let go of the mouse, the overlay will automatically disappear. In order to apply a crop, I would simply tap the Enter or the Return key. But just like anything that you do in the Develop module, it is non-destructive. It's not a permanent change. So if I tap the R key again, we can see that the extra information here has not been cropped off permanently. Now, if I want to change the crop, I can simply click and drag on any of the handles here. If I want to reposition the crop, we can go ahead and move the cursor inside the crop marquee and just click and drag in order to reposition it. There are also options in the panel here. So for example, you can see that the aspect ratio is locked right now to the aspect ratio as the photograph was shot. So that happens to be a 2:3 aspect ratio. But of course, I can select one of these other aspect ratios from the list, maybe 4:5, for example. Or we can go down to the custom area. You can actually enter in your own custom aspect ratio. Okay, let me just go ahead and make that a little bit larger and keep that constrained to 1:1 or to a square. I'm noticing that the image isn't exactly straight, so I'm going to position my cursor outside of the crop marquee. You'll notice that there's a new icon there, the double-headed arrows. If I click and drag, you can see that I can actually rotate the image in order to straighten that horizon a little bit. Of course, I can also use the angle tool in order to do that. So I can click on the angle tool, and then I can actually drag across a horizon, and as soon as I let go, Lightroom will automatically straighten it for me. Now let's go ahead and tap the Return or the Enter key in order to apply that crop, and let's talk about how we might apply the same crop to multiple images. Well, if I move to the next image, you can see that I have an option here that says Previous. If I click on Previous, Lightroom will crop this image to the same crop that was just performed on the last image. But you have to be a little careful. Because we only cropped the image, that was the only thing that changed. If, however, I had changed maybe like the exposure, or I'd also gone in and changed some color settings, everything would be updated at one time. So although this Previous button is convenient, it's not always the option with the most control. So what you might want to do instead is, if you've cropped a single image like this, and then you want to crop a series of images, select that series down here in the film strip. I've got the first one selected. I'll hold down the Shift key and select the range. And then you'll notice once you have more than one image selected, it now says sync. When I click on the sync button, I can then choose exactly what attributes in order to synchronize. So I'll turn off the effects here, and then I'll turn on the crop, and then click synchronize. And we can see now down here in the film strip, each one of these images has now been cropped to that 1:1 aspect ratio. All right, now let's take a look at an image where we can use the basic panel in order to make some adjustments. And let's take a look also at how those adjustments affect the histogram. So the histogram is in the upper right-hand corner, and basically it's a visual representation of all of the values in your image. And I can tell right away that this image is a bit underexposed. And I know that because there's a lot of really dark areas, especially here in the foreground. And there aren't any true highlights area over here. So you can see that right here on the right-hand side, my histogram basically stops. So this image is not taking advantage of the entire dynamic range that it could be, meaning that certainly there are a lot of shadow values here, but there really aren't any highlight values. So the first thing that I probably want to do is take a look at this basic panel and then increase the exposure slider. And you'll notice that each one of these sliders, the exposure, the highlights, shadows, whites, and blacks, they all correspond with different areas in the histogram. And in fact, when I just move my cursor over the histogram, those corresponding sliders actually highlight. Now, I don't have to use the sliders if I don't want to. I can actually click and drag directly in the histogram, but let's take a look at what the sliders do. So the first thing I'll do is increase that exposure a little bit. And you can watch as I increase my exposure, we're watching the histogram kind of shift over to the right because these are where all of your highlight areas are and these are where all your shadow areas are. So that's looking better already. But I think I actually want to make use of the entire dynamic range. So what I might do is actually click Auto and see if Lightroom can't just set the black point and the white point for me. And sure enough, it did. So now that I'm using the entire dynamic range, now I just need to refine how the image looks here. And I think that my highlight areas are actually too bright here. So I'm going to use my highlight slider and just scoot this down a little bit. You can see that I still have really bright values. These are the values here. These are my whites, so I'm not adjusting them. I'm only adjusting my highlights, which is in this area here, when I move my highlight slider. So now I can see a lot more detail in the cloud area as well as in the waterfall area. But this foreground area is still too dark, so I'm going to use the shadow slider. I'm going to move that over to the right even farther than Lightroom did when I clicked the auto button, just so that I can see into those shadow areas. And if we wanted to see a quick before and after, I could tap the Y key. The Y key is the shortcut for this icon right here, the before and after left-right view. And let's go ahead and just close this panel on the left by clicking on the icon to the far left. You can see it's a little triangle. If I click on that, it will just close that panel so I can see this image a lot larger. Now I might want to make a few additional adjustments. If I just scroll down a little bit, we can see that the basic panel also has this area here where I can change the clarity, vibrance, and saturation. So as I move up the clarity slider, you can see it almost appears as if the image is getting sharper. And that's because clarity adds a little bit of contrast along the edges in the midtone of my image. So it's going to trick my eye into thinking that the image is sharper. I can also add vibrance if I just want to make the image pop a little bit, or if I wanted to give it a more subdued look, of course we could take the vibrance the other direction. Now the vibrance slider is a relative slider, so even if I take the vibrance out like 100%, you'll still be able to see some color in this image. And I'll go ahead and tap the Y key again, or we could just click this icon right here in order to go back and get out of that before and after preview just to make sure that we can see this large enough. In fact, I could even zoom in, but you can see there's definitely still some greens and yellows in the image. Now, if I reset the vibrance slider by double clicking on it, and I take the saturation slider down to -100, then we can see that actually all of the color has been removed from this image. So saturation is not a relative slider. We could also, of course, add saturation. You just want to be really careful with saturation, especially if you're dealing with skin tones, because saturation has the tendency to give a person a look as if they're sunburned. So if I had a portrait here, I would definitely want to use the vibrance slider instead of the saturation slider in order to add a little bit more color to the image. All right, let's go ahead and take a look at this next image. Again, I'll tap the Y key just so we can see this before and after view. And I'm going to start with exposure. I'm just going to move the exposure up a little bit. Now I'm going to move the whites over to the right, but by default, I can't tell when I've pushed the whites too far. Obviously, I can see here in the histogram that the whites are kind of climbing this right-hand side, but if I want to get a visual indication in my image, I can use these two icons. These are my clipping icons. I can hover on top of them to see the highlight clipping, or hover here to see the shadow clipping, or I can toggle them on by tapping the J key. Now they're permanently on even if I move my cursor away. So now I know that I've actually overexposed those whites. I've pushed them too far so that they're clipping to pure white. So I would just need to back off on this. So you can see how the clipping highlights really can help you as you're making changes and setting your white and black point. Likewise, if I start moving the blacks too far, the highlight color here is blue. That tells me that I'm clipping this whole area to pure black. So obviously I'd want to back off on that. And then if I wanted to see into these shadow areas, I'm going to move my shadow slider to the right so that we can see more detail. And if I want to bring in more detail to my cloud area, because those are in my highlight area, we can see this big spike in the histogram here, I would move my highlights down to the left. Now I'm going to add a little bit of clarity as well. You'll notice it adds a little bit of contrast. The image starts looking a bit sharper. And we could add vibrance or saturation, but when we do that, the lake just looks really fake. So I'm going to double click on vibrance, and instead of making a global change to all the colors at one time, I'm going to scroll down to the HSL area. Now in hue, saturation, and luminance, I actually can choose which color range I want to make changes to. So let's start with hue for a minute, because I remember these mountains as being a little bit more vibrant and a little bit more green. So I'm going to grab my targeted adjustment tool here. I could just use the slider and change the hue of the yellow here, but if I don't know, for example, if I need to change the yellow or green, it's a better idea to grab your targeted adjustment tool by just clicking on the dot, and then when you click over the hue that you want to change, dragging up moves the slider in one direction and dragging down moves the slider in the other direction. So I'm just going to move that up just a little bit to make it a little bit greener, but I also want to add a little saturation. So I'll scoot over to the saturation area. I'll click and drag up again. That makes it more saturated. Clicking and dragging down desaturate. So I'll click and drag that up a bit. And then I'll move over to the luminance area, and we could drag up to make the area lighter or drag down in order to make it darker. So you can see I can make huge changes to color, not only the hue, but also the saturation and luminosity of that color. Instead of doing a global adjustment in the basic panel, I can use HSL instead. So while we're here with luminance, let's go ahead and click and drag up in the red areas. You'll notice that the reds that I clicked on were made up of both red and orange, so both of those sliders moved at once. I'll go to saturation, click and drag up on that as well to increase saturation. And I'm also going to click and drag up over in this area because there's a little bit of red over there that I also want to increase. So you can see I increase obviously the green of the mountains and the red in the rock without changing the blue of the lake. So it's a great way to make selective adjustments based on color range. All right, one last thing that I do want to show you. I'm going to return back to this image right here, tap the Y key to turn off the before and after. This image just looks a little bit too blue to me. I don't think the white balance is correct. So I'm going to scroll back up to the basic panel, and I have a variety of different ways of changing the white balance. I can select from the list here from auto versus daylight versus cloudy. And of course, you'll have a different list based on the camera that you're using. It's a much shorter list if you've captured in JPEG, but because this is a RAW file, I have all sorts of different options. So I could select from the list. I could also come down here and simply use the temperature slider and the tint slider in order to change the white balance. Or if I know something to be neutral in my image, I can use the white balance selector. As soon as I put the eyedropper over an area in my image, it's going to show me a loop, that grid right there that shows me what color I'm over. And so all I would need to do is pick a value that I think should be neutral. You'll see if I move it over here, it's going to actually make the image look too blue. So I could grab that again, scoot over to maybe this top area. I don't need a white point, I just need a neutral value. So you don't want to pick the brightest value in your image. You just want to pick a value in your image that you think should be neutral. It should not have a color cast. Click on that, and that would set the white balance. And again, if I wanted to apply that to more than one image, all I need to do is select those images down here in the film strip, click on the sync button, and then just target the white balance that I want to adjust. I'll click synchronize, and that set of instructions, that correction, has now been applied to all three of those images that were selected. All right, that wraps up some of the basic tools in the Develop module that you can use to enhance and correct your images. My name's Julianne Cost. Thanks for joining me.